Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Hard day's night. I want to hold your hand. Can't buy me love. Which decade am I talking about?
60s.
60s. Thank you. 60s. I was a child during the 60s, through all of the 60s. I have a twin brother and two older brothers and an older sister. So, as a child in the 60s, I was exposed to a lot of music that teenagers were listening to because my older siblings were all becoming teenagers during that decade. Now, I have vivid memories of a band called the Beatles. I remember running home from school in grade 1 and 2 to watch Beatles cartoons with my best friend who happened to be English and talked just like the Beatles. It was fantastic. Another memory I have of the Beatles was standing with my entire family, all 7 of us, I think in Flemington Road, North Melbourne, watching the Beatles motorcade on its way from Essendon Airport to the Southern Cross Hotel during the tour of Australia. Another memory I have is going to Croydon, or going to Coles in Croydon, where we live with Mum and Dad, and they bought my twin brother and I a Beatles wig. Did you ever see them? Did you know them? Coles used to sell plastic mock tops. They were the Beatles wigs. Because the Beatles were believed to have long hair back then. The hair was over their ears and over their collar. It was amazing. So we were walking around with these black Beatles wigs. It was fantastic. So we were living in that environment, and we moved to Box Hill in 1965, Box Hill North, brand new home. And the pride and joy of our home was the stereo. And back then, these were big units. This stereo took up half the lounge room. It was a big wooden cabin. We'd never heard the word hi-fi back then. This was a stereo. You'd open up the lid, turntable, a spot for the LPs, a spot for the record cleaner and all the accessories. It was fantastic. So I was hearing all this fantastic music back then from my older brothers and sisters. I was hearing the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, the band, a little soul music from people like the Supremes and the one and only Aretha Franklin. And that is a 12-inch vinyl LP. Do you know of those? Vinyl. So they were fantastic times. And back then the music was groundbreaking. It was fresh. It was exciting. We hadn't heard it for the 5,000th time as a classic on Gold 104.3. This was new music. But the standout performer back then, to me, was the big O, Roy Orbison. My sister was a huge fan. My brother was as well. Now the big O, the one and only. If you don't know him, and I'm sure most of you do, but here he is. His golden greats, Roy Orbison. Now, a few points to note about Roy Orbison. He wore dark glasses, obviously. Why was that? Was he half blind? What was it? It's a simple matter. On tour once, he forgot his prescription glasses. He left during the day wearing his sunglasses, goes to the concert, doesn't have his prescription glasses. He had to wear his sunglasses. His management said, "That looks fantastic, that's cool, stick with it." Forever and a day, he wore dark glasses after that. So that was a big feature. Another thing about Roy, the girls just loved him. My sister Judy and her best friend Christine, also known as Judy Baby and Chrissy Babe, they went to Festival Hall 3 times in Melbourne and saw Roy Orbison perform. They would scream their lungs out. The girls just loved him, especially when he does that little growl during Pretty Woman. he was a huge star. He was magnificent. And he had a string of hits. For example, Only the Lonely, Pretty Woman, In Dreams, Crying, Running Scared. Huge decade for Roy Orbison in the 60s. But another thing about Roy Orbison, to me, was his calmness, his sense of calm and his sense of humour. He was a sensible man in the crazy 60s. And he was a man who experienced tragedy in his life. For example, his first wife, Claudette, was killed in a motorbike accident as they were reconciling. They had a period of separation, they were getting together, and Claudette was killed. 2 years later, when Roy Orbison was touring Great Britain, which he did a number of times, he was a huge star in Great Britain. His 2 young sons, who were back home, his luxury home in California, died in a house fire. And Roy Orbison went through a career slump during the 70s. He had triple bypass surgery. And I saw an interview of him recently where the interviewer said, "Your wife was killed in a motorbike accident. Your young sons, under 10, were killed in a house fire. You had triple bypass surgery." That would break a lot of men. I just said, yeah. But it didn't break him. He kept his sanity. And to me, and what I'd like to explore a little tonight, with my connection to that decade and that music, is what I believe is a high level of consciousness or almost enlightenment in somebody like Roy Orbison, who was a very creative person. Not only did he sing the music, he wrote the music. A lot of it was co-written with a Texan friend, Joe Nelson, but he had a string of hits that he created, and he was an absolute star. Now, what I believe, and some of you have heard me talk before, I have a great interest in the power of the mind and what goes beyond the mind. And the late Darryl Rainey, who was a microbiologist and biochemist, a New Zealand born person, has explored this through a book called Music of the Mind. And he believes there are different levels of consciousness. And Eckhart Tolle, who's written a book called Power of Now, is very much into this. And our connection with what he calls being and consciousness, and getting inside yourself, knowing yourself, and through that, knowing the planet and beyond, and having some connection with other people. And I believe that's an evolutionary thing, according to Darryl Rainey. We've come a long way as a species, and we're not confined to this world that we can see and hear. You know, we can go, and as time goes on, he believes we will go beyond that. And I believe that creative people can experience that. And I'll conclude with what I believe is a great example of this, where somebody creative like Roy Orbison was involved with another person, Bono from U2. Bono tells a story in a documentary about Roy Orbison called In Dreams. It was the night before a concert at Wembley Stadium, and he couldn't sleep very well, and he'd been listening to a soundtrack of a movie called Blue Velvet by David Lynch from 1987, which featured the song In Dreams. And he was tossing and turning. He thinks it was because of the big concert on the way the next night. And he woke up the next morning, he had this song in his head called She's a Mystery to Me, and he didn't know where it came from. He said, "Is that a Roy Orbison song?" He didn't know. And he said to the other band members, do you know this tune, She's a Mystery to Me? There's, no, I've never heard of it. He said, "It sounds like a Roy Orbison song. Never heard of it." And the band, at that night, backstage, the band had performed, and he had this song. He'd written a few notes and a bit of the melody. And they were backstage, and there was a knock on the door. Security came in, and they said, "Roy Orbison's at the door. He wants to meet you guys." And the band is saying, "Come on, you've said this." "Oh," he said, "this is true." I believe Bono. Bono's had an audience with the Pope. Bono's raised millions for people in poverty. Roy Orbison came in, he said, "Pleased to meet you. I'm here with my daughter and my wife. My daughter's a huge fan. I've never heard you guys before, but I really like your music. I'm wondering if you might have a song for me." Bono said, "I've got a song. She's a Mystery to Me." It was the main track on Roy Orbison's biggest selling album ever, called Mystery Girl. And that's how it came about. And I believe there's a huge connection there. It's an example of great consciousness and great enlightenment.